Few emotional bonds run as deep as those between grandparents and grandchildren. It's not just affection, it's a feeling bound by memories, interrupted dreams, and often a silent attempt to atone for what they couldn't give to their own children. In the eyes of the world, grandparents are a source of warmth, protection, and wisdom. But in the light of psychoanalysis, these relationships can also contain hidden traps. According to Sigmund Freud, the unconscious does not fall asleep with agate, simply changes form. Repressed desires, unresolved conflicts, and unprocessed feelings from youth continue to operate, though in a disguised way. Many grandparents believe they are helping, but in reality, they are repeating old patterns. Without realizing it, they project expectations onto their grandchildren that do not belong to them, interfere with their upbringing, suppress their emotional growth, or foster dependence. Most of these mistakes are born from genuine but misguided love. Freud warned us that when love is unconscious of its roots, it can become possessive, controlling, or suffocating. To love too much without understanding why is just as dangerous as not loving at all. And in a family context, this excess can lead to long-lasting trauma. Children do not understand the complexities of adult attachment, they simply feel it. And if a grandchild grows up in an environment where love is accompanied by guilt, comparison, or emotional overwhelm, they may develop anxiety, fears, or a fragile sense of self. What begins as a gesture of affection can, over time, become a scar that's difficult to explain. This video is not a criticism of grandparents. On the contrary, it is a call for reflection for those who want to be a positive presence in the upbringing of their grandchildren. Because being a grandparent is not just about physical presence, it's about understanding the invisible impact every gesture, every word, and every silence can have on a child's developing mind. You can either help build a healthier future or repeat the pain of the past. The difference lies in how consciously you love. That's why we'll now explore 7 mistakes which, according to Freudian psychoanalysis, can threaten a grandchild's success, self-esteem, and emotional balance even when done with the best intentions. If you love your grandchildren and want to make them freer, safer, and better prepared for life, stay with us. What you're about to hear may forever change your relationship with the ones you hold most dear. Mistake 1. One of the most delicate situations in the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren arises when grandparents unintentionally cross the boundaries of parental authority. Freud taught us that children build their understanding of the world based on the authorities around them. When a grandfather contradicts the rules set by the father, or when a grandmother overrides the guidance of the mother, a field of psychological tension arises within the child. The child begins to live in a confusing space where boundaries are unclear and where right and wrong change depending on which adult is present. According to Freud, this hinders the development of the superego mental structure that internalizes social norms and values. Children who grow up without a clear sense of authority may struggle with rules, limits, and frustration. They may also, albeit unconsciously, learn to manipulate situations to their advantage by aligning with the adult who offers the least resistance. Instead of maturing, they adapt to emotional gaps in their environment. Many grandparents, driven by affection, end up saying things like, "Grandma doesn't mind, just don't tell your mum," or, "If your dad complains, tell him I gave you permission." Statements like these, while seemingly harmless, destabilize the child's sense of order and safety. Freud warned that a child's psyche needs consistency, and when that consistency is broken, anxiety arises. Another important aspect is that by interfering in the decisions of the parents, grandparents sow resentment not only between the adults but also within the child. The grandchild may begin to view the father as strict, and the grandfather as indulgent, the mother as harsh, and the grandmother as an ally. This internal split can make it harder for the child to form relationships based on trust. And beyond that, there is a risk that few people recognize. the infantilization of parents in front of their children. When a grandfather corrects his adult son in the presence of a grandchild, or when a grandmother openly disagrees with her daughter-in-law, the child receives an implicit message: your parents don't know what they're doing, but I do. This kind of dynamic weakens the emotional structure of the entire family. Freud observed that the repetition of conflicting authority patterns often stems from unresolved relationships in the past. A grandfather who never acknowledged his son's independence now tries to regain control by instructing the grandchild. A grandmother who always felt devalued by her daughter-in-law now tries to reclaim power by interfering in the mother's decisions. The role of grandparents is not to compete with the parents, but to support, respect, and strengthen the family structure. When disagreements arise, the ideal approach is to have a conversation away from the children, maintaining a unified front in their eyes. Being good grandparents does not mean always yielding or pleasing at any cost. It means being a pillar of support, not a bridge that divides. Preserving parental authority is, above all, an act of protecting the grandchild's emotional well-being. If you enjoy reflections like these, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single video. Mistake 2. Projecting personal failures. Freud said that the unconscious mind works most intensely when we try to silence it. And one of the most common manifestations of this unprocessed unconscious is projection. In the role of grandparents, this projection often takes the form of expectations, disguised as encouragement, the hope that the grandson will achieve what the grandfather could not, that the granddaughter will shine where the grandmother once failed, that the mistakes of the past will be corrected by the new generation. Projection, in Freudian terms, is the displacement of inner content outward. When grandparents see in their grandchild a reflection of their own failures or disappointments, they stop perceiving the child as an autonomous being. They begin to treat them as a project, as a personal new beginning. The grandchild is no longer just a child, but a symbol. This dynamic begins subtly. Grandparents start saying things like, "You'll become what I never was. At your age, I dreamed of this but never made it." Or, "This is your chance to do things differently." Although these phrases may seem motivating, they carry unresolved pain. The problem with such relationships is that they deprive the child of the right to choose who they want to be. They begin to believe that their worth lies in fulfilling someone else's dreams. And this feeling, according to Freud, fuels the superego with external demands, creating a sense of obligation that does not reflect the child's real needs. Moreover, this projection can lead to deep psychological blockages. Growing up under the shadow of their grandparents' expectations, grandchildren may develop a chronic fear of failure, a persistent sense of inadequacy, and difficulty accepting themselves as enough. Freud also emphasized that parents, and by extension, grandparents unconsciously transmit not only their desires to their children and grandchildren, but also their suffering. A grandfather who failed in his career may, without realizing it, push his grandson toward what he considers a safer path. A grandmother who grew up in poverty may impose on her granddaughter an obsessive pursuit of stability. Projection happens silently, and often without the projector's awareness, but its consequences run deep. Grandchildren should not carry the burden of their grandparents' past. They must be seen in their own uniqueness with their choices, their mistakes, and their desires. True love, as Freud noted, begins when we recognize the other as different from ourselves. When grandparents can look at their grandchild and see not a reflection, but an autonomous universe, healthy relationships begin. Relationships in which attachment does not take away freedom, but liberates it. That's why the first step to avoiding this mistake is simple, yet profound. To honestly ask yourself, is what you want for your grandchild truly their desire, or merely an unconscious continuation of a story you have not yet finished living? Mistake 3. Of all the gestures grandparents can offer, few are as common as the desire to protect. It's natural to want to spare grandchildren from the pain we've already faced, the injustice we've known, and the suffering that has marked us. However, as Freud warned, what is born from fear can disguise itself as care and ultimately cause deep harm to a child's emotional development. Overprotection is not simply excessive zeal. It is often a reflection of unresolved inner issues. The adult is afraid that the world will hurt the child the same way it once hurt them, and so they try to shield them from every unpleasant experience. In childhood, every challenge overcome, no matter how small, is a step toward independence. Tying shoelaces, resolving a conflict with a classmate, not giving up after making a mistake, all of these help build the ego structure which, according to Freud, organizes reality and mediates impulses. When grandparents interfere in all of these situations, they hinder the grandchild's ability to strengthen this vital part of the psyche. An overly protected child grows up with the sense that the world is too dangerous to face alone. They learn that they need an adult by their side to make every decision, to take every step. This does not make them safer, it makes them dependent. And this dependence, contrary to what one might think, does not foster gratitude, but fear and emotional fragility. Many grandparents believe they are expressing love by not allowing their grandchild to suffer. But Freud taught us that moderate suffering, when well integrated, is a natural stage in the formation of the psyche. Without small disappointments, there is no maturing. Without obstacles, there is no growth. Excessive comfort numbs the ability to cope with reality. Moreover, overprotection can lead to regressive behavior. Grandchildren who are used to being shielded from everything often struggle to take responsibility. They expect the world to treat them with the same indulgence their grandparents did. And when that doesn't happen, when they encounter the coldness of external demands, they feel hurt, disoriented, or angry. There is also a subtler consequence. The grandchild may develop a sense of guilt for disappointing their grandparents when they fail to live up to the expectation of perfection. According to Freud, this feeling fuels neuroses that can persist into adulthood. It's important to remember that protection is not about preventing pain, but about preparing to face it. The role of conscious grandparents is not to place the grandchild in a bubble, but to offer support so they can learn to stand on their own. This often requires more courage than stepping in. It requires watching closely through trials, errors, and stumbles, and still believing the child will rise. It does not suffocate, control, or invalidate another person's experience. Love that nurtures is love that teaches one to face the world, not love that turns the world into a fantasy. To be a grandparent means having the wisdom to know when to hold on and when to let go. Mistake 4. Unconscious use of guilt. Love, when misunderstood, can take subtle forms of manipulation. Perhaps the quietest and most destructive of these is the unconscious use of guilt. Many grandparents, without realizing it, resort to this mechanism to keep their grandchildren close, to feel needed, or simply to fill emotional voids left unaddressed throughout their lives. Freud warned that guilt used as a tool of attachment undermines freedom and destroys spontaneity. It often appears disguised as outbursts of anger. "I'm no longer interesting to you. No one has time for the elderly. I feel like you've forgotten me," repeated many times. These statements create in the grandchild an unpleasant sense of emotional obligation. They start visiting their grandparents not because they want to, but out of fear of causing them pain. In psychoanalysis, this process is understood as emotional transference, where grandparents place on the grandchild a responsibility that does not belong to them to compensate for feelings of loneliness, abandonment, or being undervalued. This burden, though invisible, weighs heavily on the child's psyche. They feel guilty for growing up, for leaving, for living their own life. Guilt in this context functions as an emotional prison. Freud understood it as operating in the unconscious like a harsh, punishing superego that condemns the child even when they behave normally. The grandchild internalizes the idea that love equals sacrifice, They learn that happiness requires suffering, and this internalization distorts their understanding of healthy relationships. Moreover, guilt creates a vicious circle. The grandchild, feeling indebted, grows closer, but this closeness does not come from the heart, it comes from fear. And when attachment is driven by fear, it becomes fragile, unstable, and incapable of generating joy. Meetings cease to be easy, they turn into tense interactions filled with subtle demands and strained silences. Another side effect is the formation of a people-pleasing personality. Grandchildren may grow up believing they must suppress their desires to meet others' expectations. This tendency, according to Freud, is one of the roots of neurotic anxiety, a subject constantly seeking approval, even at the cost of their authenticity. It is understandable that grandparents feel nostalgia, a desire for connection, and even fear of being forgotten. But when these feelings turn into emotional blackmail, they lose their nobility. There are healthier ways to build relationships: gentle invitations, sincere interest, and open listening. Relationships founded on true love do not require forced presence, but cultivate bonds that withstand time and distance. Conscientious grandparents understand that their role is not to control the purity of visits, but to make each meeting so meaningful that the grandchild wants to return. A mature grandmother knows that her value lies not in being remembered out of guilt, but in being sought out of love. Freud reminded us that freedom is essential for the existence of any attachment. If guilt enters through the door, joy leaves through the window. Paradoxically, freeing grandchildren from these emotional obligations is the best way to keep them close. Mistake 5. Toxic comparisons between grandchildren, children, brothers, and sisters. Of all the gestures capable of silently wounding a child, few are as underestimated and as common as comparison. Your brother was more obedient. Your cousin got better grades. When your father was your age, he was already helping the family. Such remarks may seem innocent, but they create a fragmented emotional world in the grandchild own that is insecure and full of doubts about their own worth. Freud noted that the child's psyche is extremely sensitive to approval and rejection. Children need to feel accepted as they are, not as what they might be. When they are compared to someone else, especially someone they love and admire, they understand that they are not enough. A feeling of inadequacy arises, taking deep root and generating a constant desire to prove their worth. Comparison turns attachment into merit. The child stops seeing themselves as unique and begins to evaluate themselves by external standards. This jeopardizes the formation of the ego, which, according to Freud, should develop autonomously, guided by individual experience rather than imposed rivalry. If the grandchild is constantly compared, they lose the right to freely express their own individuality. Moreover, comparison fosters silent rivalry within the family. A grandchild who is overly praised in front of others may become the object of resentment, while the one who is undervalued tends to withdraw or seek attention through artificial means. Such dynamics sow the seeds of rivalry that can persist into adulthood. Many grandparents believe they are encouraging their grandchild by mentioning another's achievements, but in practice, they create an idealized model that is rarely attainable. The child does not feel inspired, they feel pressured, and this pressure, even if unspoken, distorts their attitude toward their own results, causing them to see mistakes as personal failures and success as an obligation. When a grandfather or grandmother says that children used to respect their parents more in the past, or that so-and-so never talked back to elders, they are not merely stating facts. They are implying that current behavior is imperfect and that their grandchild does not meet the expected standards. Another risk is the crystallization of labels. Good granddaughter, rebellious grandson, difficult son, proper daughter-in-law. These roles, repeated over time, stick to people as if they were absolute truths. The child begins to act according to what is expected of them, abandoning their spontaneity. As a result, a rigid ego is formed, designed to please rather than to express itself. A healthy environment does not require comparisons. It welcomes differences, values uniqueness, and recognizes that each person has their own timing, story, and way of being. Grandparents who observe carefully become aware of each grandchild's unique talents. A grandmother who listens with her heart understands that a person's silence does not mean disinterest, it is simply another way of expressing attachment. Freud said that unconditional acceptance is one of the pillars for building a balanced psyche. Avoiding comparisons is not just about avoiding conflict, it is about giving the grandchild permission to be who they are, without the burden of having to surpass someone or please everyone. Mistake 6. Repeating unconscious family patterns. Freud warned us that everything unresolved will be repeated. This simple yet alarming statement reveals a common mechanism in family relationships, the unconscious repetition of inherited patterns. Grandparents, even unintentionally, often recreate with their grandchildren the same dynamics they had with their own parents or children, thereby reinforcing cycles that should have been overcome. A grandmother scolds her grandson with the very words she once heard from her mother. A grandfather, noticing the boy's behavior, responds with the same harshness he once hated in his own father. This repetition is not the result of a conscious choice. According to Freud, this compulsion to repeat is the mind's attempt to symbolically master an unresolved experience. By repeating it, the person feels they somehow control what once caused them pain. However, by doing this unconsciously, they turn their grandchild into the arena of conflicts that do not belong to the child. They might be overly critical grandparents because they were raised in a demanding environment and believe that this is the only way to build character, or a grandmother who offers affection only in the form of gifts, because she herself never received verbal or physical affection in childhood. These attitudes, although they may seem normal, have roots in undeniable personal experiences. The problem is that these repetitions do not respect the individuality of the new generation. Grandchildren do not need to relive the experiences of their grandparents. They deserve a space where they can build their own emotional trajectory without being pulled into old stories. When grandparents fail to recognize that they are stuck in a pattern from the past, they ultimately suppress the possibility of a freer, more authentic connection. Freud viewed these repetitions as psychic defenses, ways the mind finds to avoid confronting the original pain. Instead of working through the suffered trauma, the person re-experiences it, hoping that this time the outcome will be different, but without realizing it, the ending almost always repeats itself. A common example is a grandmother or grandfather who grew up without a father and tries to compensate by being overly present, even to the point of invading the child's space. Or a grandmother who was raised in silence and coldness and tries to fill everything with words, opinions, and constant interference, not realizing that she is not truly being listened to. These are ways of repeating the past in a different form, but with a similar essence. Breaking free from these cycles requires courage. One must look carefully. Do I relate to my grandchild as they are, or as I was treated? Am I reacting to them or to my own memories? Recognizing these repetitions is the first step to overcoming them. Being a grandmother or grandfather does not mean reliving your own childhood or unresolved parenthood. It is the beginning of a new way of loving, more conscious, freer, less bound by the chains of the past. Freud believed that true emotional maturity occurs when we are able to name what drives us. And when that happens, we finally stop repeating ourselves and begin to transform. Mistake 7. Confusing physical presence with emotional presence. To be present is not the same as being available. Many grandparents believe that simply being physically near, driving to school, feeding, watching TV together, already guarantees a deep connection with their grandchildren. But Freud warned that attachment is measured not by bodily proximity, but by the quality of emotional relationships established in silence, in listening, in genuine attention. Physical presence without emotional connection can be lonelier than absence. A grandchild who lives daily with a grandfather, who doesn't listen, doesn't observe with real interest, and is always thinking about something else, develops a special kind of loneliness, a feeling of invisibility, even when accompanied. Freud noted that from early childhood, people seek emotional mirrors, figures who see them, validate them, and understand them. When this need is unmet, an internal emptiness forms. The child begins to doubt their own significance because their feelings find no resonance in others. A gesture, an emotion, doubts, all go unnoticed. Such emotional neglect, even if unintentional, has its consequences. Grandchildren grow up learning to hide their feelings. They think their thoughts don't matter, that their emotions are unimportant. They adapt to affective silence and gradually build barriers that prevent them from opening up. Relationships with grandparents, even if frequent, become superficial, mechanical, and lacking depth. You don't have to be together all the time you need to be whole when you are together. A simple, attentive look during a conversation, a gesture, listening without judgment, a comment that shows genuine interest. Emotional absence, on the other hand, can be disguised as routine. Grandparents who perform everyday tasks but never ask how their grandchild is feeling. A grandmother who offers food and gifts but does not share stories or feelings. Such superficial coexistence does not nourish the child's inner world. It merely fills time with activities. Freud identified that the absence of emotional connection in childhood can lead to insecure adults who try to compensate in other relationships for what they lacked. These are people who cling with fear, who demand too much, and who find it difficult to trust. To build a genuine bond, grandparents need to allow themselves to be emotionally available. This means listening without rushing, accepting without trying to fix, and being present even when there are no words. It implies demonstrating that attachment does not depend on perfect behavior or obedience, but on deep, calm, and loving acceptance. The true legacy grandparents can leave is not memories of walks or gifts, but the grandchild's certainty that there was someone who saw them through and through. Freud reminded us that childhood is characterized above all by what is felt, and the sense of being fully accepted allows the child to grow up safe, confident, and internally free. Block 9. Conclusion: the invisible legacy. When we think of legacy, we almost always imagine something material, property left by will, inheritance to be divided, memories kept in a cherished object. However, the most enduring legacy is invisible, takes up no physical space, and cannot be measured. It lives in the people we help shape. It lives in how they love, how they see the world, how they care for themselves, and how they relate to others. This is the true legacy of grandparents, and, at the same time, the most underestimated. Freud taught us that the first emotional bonds shape the emotional structure of the personality. It is these early, often silent experiences that determine how a child will relate to independence, disappointment, love, and their own desires. When grandparents offer conscious attachment, they are not merely building a relationship with their grandchild. But when attachment is burdened by projections, control, guilt, or comparisons, it causes pain. And these wounds, as Freud knew, do not disappear over time. They become symptoms, behavioral patterns, recurring choices that seem inexplicable. That is why the mistakes we discuss here are not minor slip-ups. It is often heard that grandparents just want to help, that they do everything out of love, and that is true. But according to Freud, love is not simply the desire for good. It is the ability to recognize when our own pains, fears, and desires speak louder than another person's reality. To love means to place the ability to listen above the desire to act. It is respect for the child's uniqueness, even if they do not meet our expectations. The 7 mistakes we present in this video are not born of ill will. They arise from a lack of awareness. Many grandparents repeat them because they were treated the same way, because they were never taught otherwise, because they believe that being present is the same as intervening, that protecting is the same as controlling, that guiding is the same as deciding. But maturity offers something valuable: the opportunity to break cycles, to do everything differently, to give grandchildren not just attachment, but freedom, not just advice, but real presence. Being a grandparent is a rare opportunity to love without the haste of youth. It means looking at your child with the calmness of someone who has already faced the world, and with the humility of someone who knows they do not have answers to all questions. Freud said that a person is always torn between the desire to repeat and the impulse to transform. When grandparents become aware of their unconscious patterns, they can choose transformation. They can become role models not by imposing, but by example, not by controlling, but by listening, by acknowledging their mistakes and seeking healthier ways. You not only help your grandchildren, you also heal parts of yourself that may have long been forgotten. The grandchild will carry with them not only what you said, but also what they felt beside you. They felt accepted, they felt seen, they felt free to be who they are. And if one day in the future they look back and say, "My grandfather taught me to be strong and unafraid. My grandmother taught me to be myself, even when the world doubted," then you will have left a legacy that no inheritance can replace. If this reflection has brought meaning to you, enjoy the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to receive more reflections like this. Stay healthy, and see you next time.